My parents stole my college fund for my sister and told her I gave it willingly. 10 years later, they asked me to fund her wedding. I sent them the bill, and the truth came out and destroyed everything they had built between us. There is a particular cruelty in being robbed by the people who are supposed to protect you, and an even more particular one in discovering, a decade later, that the story they told about the robbery was the cruelest part of all. I am going to tell you about my parents and my sister and a college fund and a wedding and a bill that I sent on a Tuesday afternoon that changed the shape of my family permanently. But I need you to sit with me for a while first, because the part that matters most is not the money. It never is. The money is just the thing the real story gets attached to, the way a smell gets attached to a memory. It's the carrier, not the content. The content is about what people decide to do with their children when the children's needs become inconvenient, and what it costs everyone when the truth of that finally comes out into the light. My parents are the kind of people who look, from the outside, like they got everything right. My father built a small contracting business from nothing over 30 years, honest work, physical work, the kind of life story that gets told at retirement parties with genuine admiration. My mother taught elementary school for 22 years and was the kind of teacher parents specifically requested, the kind whose former students still stopped her in the grocery store 15 years later to say she'd made a difference. They went to church on Sundays. They paid their bills. They owned a house in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and watched out for each other. They had, by every visible metric, built a decent life and lived it decently. What they also had was a system. I did not understand it was a system while I was growing up inside it. I understand it now with the sharp, retroactive clarity of someone who has had years to look at the pattern from the outside. The system was this: my sister Brianna was the one things flowed toward, and I was the one things flowed away from. Not in a dramatic, overtly cruel way. Not in a way that would have been obvious to an outside observer or even to a child. In the quiet, cumulative way that systems of preference operate inside families. So gradual that each individual instance seems reasonable, and so consistent that the cumulative effect is devastating. Brianna was younger than me by 3 years and had arrived in the family in the way that some second children do, with a particular sweetness and ease that made everyone around her want to make things nice for her. She was charming in the unself-conscious way of people who have never had to try to be charming. She cried easily and recovered quickly and had a gift for making my parents feel necessary to her in a way that I, who was more independent from early on, apparently did not. I am not blaming Brianna for this. I want to be very clear about that. She was a child. She did not design the system. She was just, by accident of temperament and birth order, the one the system organized itself around. I noticed it the way children notice most things, not as a policy to be named and challenged, but as an atmosphere, a pressure, a slight but persistent imbalance in how the world was organized. I noticed that my activities were negotiable and hers were not. That my mistakes were examined and hers were excused. That when resources were finite, and they were often finite, the finite resources tended to flow in a particular direction and I was not that direction. I adapted. Independent children do. I learned to need less, to ask for less, to build more of what I needed from what I could put together myself. By the time I was a teenager, I had a part-time job, my own savings account, and a plan for college that I'd been researching for 2 years. The plan included a college fund. My parents had started one for each of us when we were born. This was a point of pride for my father, who talked about it as evidence of his responsibility and foresight. He mentioned it at family dinners sometimes, the way proud parents do. He'd say he'd made sure both his kids would be able to go to school without starting their lives in a hole, and he meant it as a statement about his character. I believed it. Why wouldn't I? I had seen the statements. I'd watched it grow. I had built my entire plan for my future around it. I was 17 when I found out it was gone. The conversation happened at the kitchen table, which is where my family had all its significant conversations, the good ones and the terrible ones arranged at the same furniture in the same room. My father sat across from me and he explained, with the particular careful calm of someone who has rehearsed a difficult thing, that there had been a decision made about the college funds. The decision was that mine had been redirected. That is the word he used. Redirected. Brianna had been accepted to a private university. A good school, genuinely, the kind of school that costs 4 times what a state school costs and produces outcomes that are not always 4 times better. The price tag was substantial and my parents had looked at their finances and made a determination. If Brianna was going to be able to go, they needed more resources than they had. They had taken what was in my fund. Money that had been accruing since my birth, money that was in my name, money I had understood to be mine, and they had applied it toward her tuition. They had not asked me. They had not told me in advance. They had made the decision and then told me after the fact, sitting at the kitchen table, presenting it as something that had been necessary and that they hoped I would understand. My father said they believed in me, that I was capable and resourceful and that I would find a way, that there were loans and scholarships and work-study programs, and that he knew I could handle it because I had always been the strong one. My mother said she was sorry. Then she said that Brianna needed this, that her particular path required it, and that they hoped when I was older I would see that they'd had no choice. I was 17 years old. I sat at that kitchen table and I listened and I did not cry, which I think surprised them, and then I said I understood and I excused myself and I went to my room and I sat on my bed and I looked at the ceiling and I thought, with the cold methodical part of my brain that has always been my primary coping mechanism. All right then, I will do this myself. And I did. I will give you the shape of the next 10 years quickly, because they are not the dramatic part of the story and because the people who have lived a version of them will recognize them without needing every detail. I applied to every scholarship available to me. I got several, though not enough to cover everything. I took out loans, less than many people, more than I would have if I'd had what was owed to me. I worked throughout college, 25 hours a week my first year and up to 30 by my third. I graduated in 4 years with a degree in accounting, a loan balance that would take me 7 years to fully retire, and a job offer that I had secured through the kind of exhaustive, self-directed effort that becomes almost automatic when you have been learning since childhood that no one is going to do it for you. I also graduated with a relationship with my family that was functional but distant, in the way that a structural repair can be functional without being fully sound. I went home for holidays. I called my mother on her birthday. I had civil, warm enough conversations with my father about neutral topics. I had a relationship with Brianna that was cordial and careful. We were not unfriendly, but we were not close, and I had never been entirely sure how much of that distance was my doing and how much was the particular weight of what had happened at that kitchen table. I had never, in 10 years, told Brianna specifically what had been taken from me and given to her. My parents had presented the situation to her as a family decision that I had been part of. Or at least that's what I assumed. She had gone to her private university and graduated and built a life and gotten engaged and seemed, by every external measure, to be doing well. I was glad for her. In the uncomplicated way I had taught myself to be glad for people I loved who had benefited from things that had also cost me. By the time I was 29, I was doing genuinely well. The accounting career had grown into something that gave me real satisfaction and real stability. I had my own apartment, my own savings, my own carefully constructed life that was mine in a way that felt important, because I had built every piece of it without help, which is a different kind of ownership than most people have and one I'd come to value deeply even as I understood the injustice of having been required to acquire it that way. And then my mother called on a Sunday afternoon and asked if I had time to talk about something exciting. Brianna was getting married. This was not a surprise. I knew she was engaged. I'd seen it on social media. I'd sent a congratulatory text that she'd responded to warmly. What my mother said next was the part that required me to put down my coffee cup and make sure I had heard it correctly. They were hoping, she said, that I might be able to contribute to the wedding. Meaningfully contribute, she clarified. Brianna and her fiancé were paying what they could, and she and my father were contributing what they could. But there was a gap, and given that I was doing well and that family was family and that Brianna would do the same for me in a heartbeat, they thought it was worth asking. She named a number. It was not a small number. I said I would think about it. My mother said she knew I'd do the right thing. After I hung up, I sat with that phrase for a long time. The right thing. I thought about what the right thing was, and I thought about a kitchen table and a 17-year-old sitting across from her parents, and a fund that had been redirected and 7 years of loan payments and 25 hours a week of work through 4 years of school, and a sentence about being the strong one and being capable of handling it. Then I opened a spreadsheet. I am an accountant. When I need to understand something, I build a spreadsheet. I gathered every document I had retained from my college years, loan statements, tuition receipts, work-study records, the original scholarship award letters. I calculated the total cost of the education I had funded myself. I calculated the interest I had paid on the loans over 7 years. I calculated the opportunity cost of the hours I had worked rather than studied or interned, using a conservative estimate of what those hours might have been worth in career terms. I added a line item labeled Redirected College Fund, original amount with the figure I had memorized from the last statement I'd seen before my father had that conversation with me. The total was considerably higher than the number my mother had named for Brianna's wedding. I formatted the spreadsheet into a clean, professional document. I put a header on it that said Financial Summary, Education Costs Independently Borne, 2012 to 2022. I added a cover note, 2 paragraphs, calm and factual, that said I had given their request careful thought and that I wanted to make sure we were having the conversation with complete information. I attached the supporting documentation. I emailed it to both my parents on a Tuesday afternoon with the subject line, Wedding Contribution, some context. I want to tell you I felt righteous and resolved when I sent it. What I actually felt was tired and sad, and something that had no clean name. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been patient for a very long time and has just done the thing they've been building toward without being sure it was the right thing or that it would change anything. Then I closed the laptop and went for a walk and tried not to think about what was coming next. What came next was not what I expected. My mother's response came within 2 hours. A long, painful email that moved through defensiveness and then grief and then a kind of desperate reframing, suggesting that I had always known the situation, that sacrifices had been made by everyone, that this was not the kind of thing that needed to be turned into an accounting exercise. My father called and didn't leave a voicemail, which meant he was angry in the particular way that prevented him from trusting himself to speak. I had expected both of these things. What I had not expected was Brianna. She called me 3 days after I sent the email. I almost didn't answer, for reasons I don't need to explain. I answered on the 3rd ring. She asked if she could come over. She drove 2 hours to my apartment on a Saturday morning and stood at my door with her coat still on and her eyes red in the way that meant she'd been crying in the car. I let her in. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, that furniture, that specific piece of furniture in a different house, the same conversation in a different configuration. And she looked at me and said, I didn't know. I looked at her. She said she had never known the money came from my fund. She said that what her parents had told her, what she had believed for 10 years, was that I had chosen to defer my fund for a few years to help cover her tuition, that it had been a gift freely given, that I had said I wanted her to have this opportunity and that I would use my fund later. She said she had thanked me for it, quietly, in her own heart, for years. She said she had thought I was generous. She said she had thought the distance between us was because I had drifted toward independence and that was simply who I was. She said she had never, in 10 years, understood that there was something specific underneath the distance. She put a folder on my table. Inside the folder were financial records, her own. She had, she explained, spent the last 3 days pulling everything together after reading my email, which my mother had forwarded to her, apparently as evidence of what I had done, and which had instead caused Brianna to sit with it for 48 hours and then start making calls and looking at documents and doing the kind of accounting she had never thought to do before. She had calculated what she'd received. The tuition, yes, but also, over the years since college, other things. Amounts my parents had contributed to her life at various points. A car, a deposit on her first apartment, a loan for a medical bill that had never been discussed as a loan, a contribution to her and her fiancé's first apartment together. She had not thought to add these things up before, because each one had felt like a separate moment of parental generosity, not an entry in a running ledger. Added together, they were substantial. She had also, in the process of pulling records, found something else. A savings account my parents maintained that neither of us had known about, discovered because she'd been listed as emergency contact on a bank document that had arrived while she was visiting them last Thanksgiving, and that she'd found in a stack of mail she'd been asked to sort. The account had been opened 12 years ago. It had a balance that suggested it had been regularly contributed to and never drawn from. She did not know whose name the account was in. She did not know what it was for, but she had written down the account number and the bank name, and she put that piece of paper in the folder too. She slid the folder across my kitchen table and said, I think we need to figure out what's actually true. I looked at my sister across a kitchen table and felt something shift that had been fixed in one position for 10 years. What we found over the following 6 weeks was not a simple story. I want to be honest about that. The most painful things rarely resolve into simple stories, and the impulse to make them simple is almost always a way of protecting someone who doesn't fully deserve protection. The savings account, it turned out, was in my father's name and had been designated in their estate documents as a fund to be distributed equally between Brianna and me upon their death. My father, when confronted with it, and I use the word confronted specifically because that is what the conversation was, said he had opened it 12 years ago partly out of guilt about the college fund, that he had been adding to it regularly since then, that he had always intended it to be a way of evening things out eventually. He said he hadn't told anyone because he hadn't known how to bring it up, and that this wasn't the conversation he'd imagined having about it. My mother, in the longer and more difficult conversation that happened the following week, said something that I am still processing and that I think will take me more time than I currently have to fully understand. She said that she had told Brianna that I had volunteered my fund because she hadn't wanted Brianna to feel guilty, and that she had told me we had no choice because she hadn't wanted me to feel singled out. She said she had constructed a version of events that protected both of us from the hardest parts and had not anticipated, had genuinely not considered, that the two versions might one day be compared in the same room. She said she was sorry. She said it several times in several ways. I do not think she was being performative. I think she had carried a real guilt about this for 10 years and had managed it the way she managed most difficult things, by building a careful structure around it and hoping it held. The structure did not hold. They never do. Brianna and I sat with all of it for a long time before we decided anything. What we decided eventually was this. We were not going to spend the years we had left as adults the way we'd spent the decade we'd just lost, in a cordial and careful distance organized around something neither of us had fully understood. We were going to try to be actual sisters instead. Not without difficulty. Not as though the past 10 years had a different texture than they did. But honestly, with the full picture in front of us, building something new that was ours rather than a product of the architecture our parents had built around us. On the question of the wedding, Brianna told our parents, in a conversation I was not present for, that she would not be accepting any contribution from me and that they should not ask again. She said it calmly and completely, which is, I have come to understand, very much her style when she has made up her mind about something. The wedding ended up smaller than they'd originally planned and entirely within what she and her fiancé could fund themselves. It was, by every account from people who were there, a beautiful day. I was there. I was her maid of honor. That surprised some people in the extended family who had watched our distance for years and not understood it. It did not surprise me. It felt, standing beside her in that church, like something coming back into alignment that had been off for a very long time. My parents and I are in an ongoing process that I am going to describe honestly as difficult and incomplete. The financial account my father had been building has been incorporated into a revised estate plan that both Brianna and I have been included in designing, which is the kind of adult conversation we should have been having for years. The larger question of trust, of whether the relationship has the foundation it needs, of whether I can sit at a table with my parents and not feel the particular weight of what that table represents, is something I am working on in therapy and in real life simultaneously with variable results. There are good days and hard days. My mother and I had a phone call last month that was the most honest we have ever had, and it ended with both of us crying, which is not something that happened in our family before and which I count, without irony, as progress. My father and I are slower. He is not a man who navigates this territory easily, and I am not going to pretend he has transformed, because he hasn't. But he is trying in the specific and limited way that he is capable of, and I have made the decision to let that be enough for now while I wait to see what accumulates. Here is what I know from the other side of this. Parents who favor one child over another rarely think of themselves as doing that. This is one of the most important things I have come to understand, not as an excuse, it is not an excuse, but as a fact that changes the shape of what you're dealing with. My parents did not wake up each morning and consciously choose to privilege Brianna at my expense. They had a system, built from unexamined preferences and old patterns and their own complicated histories, and they operated inside it with the conviction that they were doing what made sense. The story they told themselves was that I was strong and would be fine and that Brianna needed more. The story they told Brianna was that I was generous and giving and that the family pulled together. The story they told me was that there was no choice. 3 stories, all curated to prevent any one of us from seeing the full picture. And it worked for 10 years. until a spreadsheet and an email on a Tuesday afternoon created the conditions for the picture to be seen whole. What the spreadsheet actually did was not win anything. I want to be precise about this because I think the satisfying version of this story, the version where I send the bill and the parents immediately understand and atone and everything resolves, is not what happened and would not have been as valuable if it had. What the spreadsheet did was create a record. It put the reality of what had happened into documented form and put that document into circulation, and once the document existed, the stories that had surrounded the reality for 10 years could not survive it. Documents are like that. The truth, once it's written down and sent, doesn't unsend. What I got from this was not the money. I am owed money, technically, and the estate process will address some of that, and I have made my peace with the fact that the address will be imperfect and incomplete and that life is like that. What I got was my sister. 10 years of necessary distance that turned out to be unnecessary. Not the distance I chose, but the distance that had been built around a lie, and that evaporated in the space of a Saturday morning at my kitchen table, when the lie was replaced with the truth. She texted me last Tuesday to ask if I wanted to come over for dinner that weekend. Not a significant occasion. Not a milestone or a reconciliation event. Just dinner, the way sisters who are actually close have dinner. I said yes. I brought wine. We talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with any of this and several things that had everything to do with it. And when I drove home that night, I thought about the 17-year-old sitting at a kitchen table being told her fund had been redirected, and I thought about what I would tell her. I would tell her, you are going to build everything yourself and you are going to be proud of that, and it is going to cost you more than it should have and also give you more than you expect, and you are going to lose something that is not what you think it is and find something that is better than you hoped for. I would tell her it takes a long time and that the long time is not wasted. I would tell her to save the documentation because someday the documentation will matter. And I would tell her that the distance between her and her sister is not permanent. That it is built on a story, and that stories, once the truth comes out, can be rewritten. Keep the receipts. Tell the truth when you're ready. Find your people on the other side of the hard part. They're worth the journey.